Sophia, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing wonderfully. How are you doing, Stephanie?
I'm very excited. I'm pumped. We were just chatting a little bit about where we want to take this. And I was like, stop, stop, stop. Let's just hit record. I want to make sure we get all of the good details here for the show. So I'm really grateful that you're able to spend some time here with me on the Market Authority Show with our audience. For those who have not yet had the pleasure of meeting you and knowing a little bit about what you're all about, would you mind sharing just a bit about your story and how you got to where you are today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So professionally, I'm a professor. I'm an assistant professor of organizational behavior at the Gabelli School of Business at Fordham University, which is right in the heart of New York City. So when I took the job, I moved to New York, and as we were talking about earlier, just absolutely adore it here. So I find a lot of flourishing personally here. Um, my research looks at this kind of broad umbrella of human flourishing. And I have several different tracks, but mostly what I'm interested in both research and teaching and speaking and doing events and conversations like this is how can we create more connection, wisdom, and flourishing in our work lives, in our professional lives. So by connection, we're talking about a sense of belonging to something bigger than ourselves, feeling seen, heard, and honored as human beings with inherent dignity. How do we create that in our work lives and at work? Wisdom being how can we take the most skillful action in any context that not only serves ourselves, but also serves more of the social good? How can we make the wise decisions for ourselves, our families, our communities in the long run, right? That serves everybody. And then flourishing, and this is kind of my favorite research track. I love talking about flourishing and researching and teaching flourishing. Flourishing is also connected to both the individual and the social good. And it's how can I create thriving beauty in my own life that enlivens me and fulfills me while simultaneously uplifting and elevating those around me through my own success. So what we find is that oftentimes flourishing and wisdom and connection, they're braided together. You can't untangle those three things. And it's all about creating both a better world and a better life for ourselves and our communities. I think that's really profound, especially in Western contexts when we tend to get kind of myopic and think in these very individual terms. We got to bring it back out to our communities and families and social worlds too.
That's fascinating. I want to acknowledge you for doing that work. It's very niche and it gets very, very deep, I can imagine. So I'm sure that requires a lot of focus and intention on your part. Where I want to see if we can take the conversation is in the context of our audience, which are primarily women real estate agents. And you guys, if you're one of our fellows listening, like this is for you too. I think that this is a really important kind of place to take this conversation, because when we're speaking about growing a real estate business, our function as professionals, truthfully, is to protect the public. And a lot of real estate agents get into the business not understanding that our number one reason for existence is to protect the public, consumers, buyers, and sellers. And it's easy to lose sight of that when we are 100% commission based, when there is more competition than ever to creating our business. And there are so many hurdles, not only from the current market conditions and the other external conditions like the pandemic, things of that nature, but also the industry is transforming so quickly that anytime you learn one thing, it's almost like you immediately have to evolve as things are changing that fast with technology and social media in our industry. So all that to say, we can get so close to our work and every next thing that we have to create in our business and forget A, that we're supposed to really be serving the greater good, the community, and B, this business is supposed to be helping us tap into our full purpose by serving and blessing our family and being able to tap into our full potential. That's where I want to kind of take this. So where is that disconnect? Is that specifically with Western culture? And I know that this was like the longest lead up question ever. But where is that disconnect? Is it specifically in Western culture where flourishing almost seems too indulgent to really translate into building a business and entrepreneurship?
Oh, that is such a fascinating way of putting it. I would say that what we find is in Western society, Western cultures, there is more of a bend toward either or thinking. And so, and that's not just related to like financial success and personal or social flourishing, but it's related to all sorts of different things, contradictions that we deal with in the day to day. But yes, definitely at a macro level, we tend to think in either or terms. I can have this, or I can have this. I can have individual flourishing or family flourishing, or I can have a thriving business. And we see that. I'm in New York City. You'll hear fire trucks and stuff going out my window.
That's totally okay.
I can hear them; they get really loud. Um, so we definitely see that either or sort of myth or ethos applied to this work-life balance dilemma, which so many people deal with. But we see it show up in many, many, many different ways. And one thing that I'd kind of like to start with, I'll tell you, is that one of the reasons that either or thinking is so prevalent in Western society actually has nothing to do, or is kind of arbitrary when it comes to the way our culture is structured. It has a lot more to do with language. So we tend to, if we look at the English language specifically, for example, we tend to talk in either or terms. So we will say things that's braided throughout our language. So it's nothing that we can control, just part of the English lexicon. We say things like up, down, left, right, you, me, small, big, rich, poor, and. And other languages have the same sort of structure as well. But in the English language, we see a very kind of prominent metaphorization, if you will, of either or terms in our language. We metaphorize our world in either or terms. And what's important about this is that we actually think in metaphor. We think in the metaphors we use, and we think in the language we use. So because our language is so kind of structured in these either or ways, which doesn't have to be, it's just the way that it kind of is structured, we think then in that either or sort of approach and perspective. And it makes it really hard for us to realize that we can find what's called the both and. The both and meaning I can do both this and this. I can find financial success and I can find individual flourishing and family flourishing. In fact, those two things might actually contribute to one another if we take a slightly different perspective. So I just wanted to start with that to kind of say it's like our language is like water to the fish. And so we think in these sort of dichotomies because of the fact that we are using this language constantly, which means we have to push back against it a bit and become really intentional with the way that we talk about things. And I can give us some tips for how to do that. And the way we talk then changes the way we see the world, truly. So I think can I share a little bit about my recent leadership study that looked specifically?
Say more.
Okay, so all right. So for the last couple of years, one of my large research projects I've been doing is I've been interviewing high-level executives, like C-suite folks, CEOs, CFOs, CMOs, et cetera, and then senior executives at companies all over the US. These are, so actually some of them are real estate, some of them are medical, education, law, energy, you name it, wellness, you name it. And I've interviewed at this point about 80 leaders in these different domains. And what's interesting about this group, and they're all successful leaders, objectively successful. Their companies are thriving. Their employees are happy, as in terms of how we kind of typically measure employee happiness at a high level, and they're profitable, right? But what's interesting is that half of these leaders are kind of standard people leading out in the world, right? Good people. And then the other half are leaders who have a long-term mindfulness practice, a meditation practice. And in this study, I really wanted to look at what is the difference that makes the difference between leaders who are crushing it out there in the world, doing a great job, earning money, profitable, thriving organization, and those who are doing all of that stuff, plus seem to have a little bit more of a wise, calm, non either or approach to running their businesses. Is there a difference? And mindfulness has been connected a lot to challenging our ways of either or thinking. It's been connected to paradoxical thinking is what it's called. So being able to solve complexity with a little bit more wisdom, mindfulness over time can create that. So I wanted to tease out the difference between these two leader groups. And what I found was that actually the mindfulness group does some things quite differently, specifically when it comes to navigating complexity. Mm-hmm. So I want to stop here for a second. I just want your listeners to think about a specific time in their own lives. So can you think, I'm talking to everybody out there, can you think about a time, specifically in your professional life, when you felt pushed and pulled between two or more things that kind of competed with each other, where you thought to yourself, oh my goodness, I have to do this and I have to do this, but these things either totally cancel each other out, or I don't have enough time in the day to do both, or they kind of just don't really leave room for one another. And this is something that people deal with constantly all the time. Doesn't matter if they're a leader, an employee, a stay-at-home mom, a stay-at-home dad, a teenager. I mean, everyone deals with competing demands, but specifically people who run their own businesses, entrepreneurs, leaders, and even more so women leaders in the world find that they are faced with competing demands. Oftentimes it's two things, that could be multiple things that kind of pull against each other. And so if that is something that you can identify, and I know I can identify, I wanted to look at the people at the top and say, well, how are these people who are really crushing it? How are they dealing with this complexity? And what I found was that in the data, it was that the group of leaders, the 40 leaders who practiced mindfulness, and these were longtime meditators. They meditate like 5 times a week, 7 times a week, for anywhere from 2 to 40 years, right? Longtime meditators. I found that they did some things differently. So the first thing that they did differently was when they were faced with competing demands, instead of ignoring them, denying them, or trying to kind of overwork or be extra to kind of fit everything in, instead what they would do is they would kind of stop for a second and they would say literally out loud, either to themselves or to their teammates, they would say, or their direct reports, we have to do this and we have to do this. And these two things can coexist harmoniously. They would say some form of that. They probably didn't put it exactly like how I put it. They said some version of that. So they basically surfaced the contradiction and they spoke it out loud. And that's really important, because if you think back to the fact that our language is wrapped in either or terms, we have to really challenge either or thinking by bringing sort of this both and thinking to the surface. So they would even go home and say this to their husbands. They would say this to their wives, their spouses, their friends. They would vocalize the competing demands, and they are not so scary once they're brought out kind of into the open. So that was the first thing. The second thing that they would do is they would, and this is actually really interesting, I think, because I've been using it myself, they would engage way more different types of processing when it came to how they processed and interpreted the information that they were given about the competing demands. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I had one participant who she basically told me, look, I have to retain this one employee. I was going to say hire, it's retain. I have to retain this employee because they are my best salesperson. At the same time, they're engaging in some behavior I think is a little unethical, and so I think I need to fire them. I can't do both of those things at once. That's like a true paradox, right? I have other people dealing with work-life balance stuff. I mean, you name it, competing tensions. I've seen it in these leaders. And so the mindful group, what they did is they engaged in 5 different information processing styles. So there are kind of 5 main ones, and the first group, the non-mindful group, did 2, and the mindful group did all 5. Basically, and this is to kind of summarize it. So one way of processing information is verbal, so speaking out loud, talking about it, talking about it to other people. The other way of processing complex information is thinking it through, rational, right? Planning, strategizing, creating pros and cons lists, anything like that, where you're really kind of analyzing, crunching numbers, that kind of stuff, right? The third, and so, by the way, so both groups did those first 2 a lot, talking about it and thinking about it. Okay, that's kind of normal because that's like human nature, right?
Yeah.
The mindful group, but they also did these three other ones that were different. They engaged in emotional processing. So what that looked like was when they were faced with complexity or competing demand, instead of just trying to think it through and talk it through and spin on a little hamster wheel of thinking, talking, thinking, talking, they would move over to this emotional place and they would tune into their emotions and they would say, how am I feeling about this contradiction? How am I feeling about this competing demand? And what might I learn from my emotions? What are my emotions telling me right now? You know, have you ever had something, Stephanie, where you're kind of, you know, running at a million miles an hour and maybe kind of a little stressed out? You don't realize you're stressed because you're just moving and moving and producing and producing. And then you realize you're not really seeing things clearly, and you kind of pause and take a breath and think, wow, I'm really stressed out right now. Maybe I need to go take an adult timeout and come back to this problem. Have you ever done that before?
Yeah. And I wonder if you think that allowed them to take the space to dive deeper to what the core issue might have been in that situation, or to have had the space to just come up with a better creative solution for the actual problem at hand, or both.
It's both plus. Yeah. So both
Okay.
plus. So moving out of the thinking, talking hamster wheel. And sometimes when we're talking, by the way, we're not talking to other people, we're talking to ourselves. So
Right.
thinking and like internal dialogue, right? So moving out of that hamster wheel to this emotional space, it allowed them to down regulate their emotions by first just becoming aware of them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm stressed. Oh, I'm caught. I'm hooked. I'm judging myself. I'm judging other people. I'm blaming. I'm projecting. I'm anxious. It usually end up coming back to I'm anxious, right? Because I've got this problem I can't solve.
So like fear
My
of the unknown.
totally fear of the unknown, fear of the unknown, fear of the not only unknown like into the future, but also not having an answer. So not knowing, you know, if I can't solve this problem, what's going to happen to my business? You know, so yeah, totally fear the unknown.
Okay.
So they would pull out of that space, and then they come over to this emotional space, and they would acknowledge their emotions, thinking, okay, I'm stressed. And when we acknowledge our emotions, that actually just that acknowledgement down regulates them slightly. So it kind of loosens some of that up. And then they would ask themselves, what's my stress telling me about how I'm coming to this problem? Because when we're stressed out, we could become more myopic. Our creativity, you mentioned creativity, our creativity narrows when we're stressed and we're not able to see as much. And it's like, I use the example oftentimes of you're running around the house late, you know, where's my phone? Where's my phone? Where's my phone? Where's my phone? I'm running out of the house. And then I hear my phone go off or, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, oh, it's in my pocket,
Right.
you know. But if I realized that I wasn't late anymore, or I didn't have to get to where I was going, or I realized I was an hour ahead, I would find it. You know, that's how our anxiety works. It kind of limits what we see. And so by down regulating, they were able to find more creative options by kind of expanding and opening up their awareness. But then they engage in something else too, a little bit deeper. Sometimes it's really hard to understand your emotions cognitively. You know, sometimes we try to analyze and self-reflect, but it's harder to understand our emotions cognitively when we're in that thinking space. So what the mindfulness group, I'll call them, did was they tuned into their physical body as a way of knowing, to understand their emotional state and then understand the problem with more wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So they would say, oh, I'm in this, you know, I'm moving fast. I'm in this kind of, I'm dealing with this problem. I'm in the middle of the situation. You know what? Okay, my chest is kind of tight. My palms are kind of sweaty. I think I'm holding my breath, you know, and that physical experience served as a signpost. And if anyone here listening has practiced with mindfulness work, this shouldn't be a surprise to you. This will sound very familiar. That physical sensation can serve as a signpost, then signals that they are in an emotional state, and can do some of that reflective work or down regulating work. And then the last way that they processed information, and this one seems very counterintuitive in some ways, but the last way they process information is what I'm calling suspended processing, which is basically just stepping away from any problem solving or decision making for an intentional, temporary period of time. And this does a lot of what you mentioned earlier, where it allowed them to come back to the problem with more creativity. And so by taking this sort of interlude, this little adult timeout from any problem solving or decision making, And it could be 5 minutes, it could be a day, it could be a week, it could be 2 weeks, whatever your kind of situation allows for.
Sure.
But by taking that time out, my participants in my study, what the data is showing is that they did a couple of very, very productive things. So the first thing that time and space allowed them was time to downregulate their emotions even further. That's one. Time to engage in self-care, which we can talk about a little bit later on this call if you'd like, because I love to share a little bit about self-care. It's very important.
Yeah.
And it also allowed them to investigate the time frame of the problem they needed to solve. So basically, most people tend to think that whatever problem, whatever organizational or professional emergency they're dealing with needs to be solved right now. And I had one of my participants, she was an entrepreneur, but she was also an ER physician. She was a trained doctor, and she did her residency in an ER. And she told me, she said, now she's an entrepreneur. She said, everyone acts like professional emergencies are life and death emergencies. She goes, I know life and death. I'm a doctor. I know, like a medical doctor. I know what life and death is. So most organizational emergencies aren't life and death, but we treat them that way. And how does the way we treat them then impact how we show up to them and our stress level, which then reduces our creativity? So she always uses language with her team to say, is this a deadline, or is this a timeline, or can this be a lifeline? And change the way we think about and structure deadlines, quote unquote deadlines. I think that was cool little languaging there that she did to reframe that for herself. I saw that a lot in the data. And then the last thing that they use that time for, that interlude, and this is really, really critical. And I think this is especially for entrepreneurs, because you're really running your show, and this is like, it feels like it's all you and the burden's all on you, right? Is stopping long enough to pull back and take that 30,000 foot view. And Stefanie, you mentioned at the beginning of this call, oftentimes people, when they're starting their business and they're thriving in their business, but they're, feeling like they need to evolve and keep up and learn the new technologies and the new marketing platforms and the new, approaches and perspectives and education and all of that, they feel like they have, they're so close to it, you mentioned. And I think that's really important and powerful, because when we can kind of pull out and look at the longer view, whether that's a timeline thing or even just coming back to my larger values, that can give us a lot more clarity and wisdom for how best to act next, how to decide, how to choose, how to move forward. And that was something the mindfulness group did. And I know I've been talking about this study for a minute, so I'll wrap up this part, but I want to just share that the second kind of piece of analysis with this study was, I didn't look just at how people responded to complexity or how they processed it, but then how they took action on it. And what I found in the data, it was kind of starking and illuminating, is that the mindfulness group, they had a much larger repertoire for action and for decisions. So how they made decisions and how they acted was over 2%. It's not 2%, over 100%. It was 2.1 times, 2.1 times larger and more varied than the other groups. So basically, in a nutshell, that means that they were more creative through this process and allowed them to kind of navigate their complexity with more ease and skill.
Wow.
So,
that was incredible. There are so many things that caught my attention. And a couple of the ideas that I was having when you were sharing those findings with me were, so much of this seems to be rooted in scarcity versus abundance mindset, getting stuck in the ego, or being in a more like creative, community-centered place of presence. How much does trauma show up here? And the reason why I ask this might sound like it's way out of left field, but I promise it ties in and it tracks. So much of performance is reliant upon our ability to make wisdom, like decisions rooted in wisdom. And when these fight or flight senses are activated, a lot of that is from previous trauma. And I've actually had the feedback, not that we get super woo in my mentoring and coaching process, but we do touch on it a little bit. I've gotten feedback on my coaching from individuals, like this happened once or twice, but I noticed it. And they said, I really just want more strategies. I want to know what I need to be doing. That's going to help get me to where I want to be. I just need more strategies. Tell me what to do. When really, it doesn't matter how good your blueprint is if you don't know how to read it. because you are scrambling up the directions based off of your inner beliefs, traumas that are unresolved, that are creating a fight or flight response that is inhibiting your ability to make these decisions.
Yeah.
Did you go into that with your research at all? Or is that more of just kind of like a confirmation of that is an issue that is seen in high performance levels?
I have done research around trauma. I think it's a really important question. I have done research around trauma at the collective level. Mm-hmm. So I have a couple of papers on how how individuals in society, but as collectives, cope and create resilience in the face of collective trauma. So I more look at it at that level. Yeah. But I think you're spot on. One of the things that we are, one of the things that's I think unfortunate in our cultural myths around performance and success is that we need to constantly be doing, performing, and gaining more and more knowledge. And I'll speak about it kind of in the context of trauma or through the language that you use. I'll speak about, I think, why that's a problem and what else we might want to do to help find flourishing and financial success in a way that's that feels better too, that actually feels better. So we tend to focus a lot, and this isn't just in business, this is in education, this is in our society. We focus a lot on knowledge acquisition, right? Growing, learning. We focus a lot on then applying and implementing that knowledge. So you give the example of someone who comes to you for coaching and says, Stefanie, tell me what to do, and then I'll go out and do it. Okay, that is kind of braided in our social consciousness about what it means to perform and succeed and be ambitious and have a hustle, right? And go out there and kill it at work, or right? Yeah. That those learning and doing, knowing, doing, and knowing and doing at a really high level, that's braided in our kind of ideas of what that looks like, what that's supposed to look like. But it's missing this really critical third component, and that is the being dimension. So we have knowing, doing, and being. Knowing is gaining information and learning and knowledge, conceptual knowledge. Doing is practical skills, putting it into action. And being, which gets neglected, is integrating what we know so that at a level of depth, so that we can embody that knowledge and that practice and enact it wisely when the stakes are high. And when the stakes are high, that can be out there in the world, like something happened, so it could be contextual. You're out, you're working, and an event happens, the stakes are high. So then how do I apply what I've learned skillfully? But it can also be an internal high stakes scenario where your emotions are high because something has triggered you, right? Or there is trauma, or someone said something or behaved in a way, or the world appears in a certain way that is very emotionally taxing on us or burdensome on us, right? Or we're having to engage in emotional labor or deal with complexity between being a business owner and a parent or a spouse or a friend or a sister or a caretaker of another family member, right? Some competing tension. So all of that can kind of pull up some, we can call it trauma, but it can also be just kind of emotional high stakes situations where then we're not able to take what we know and what we do, or what we know to do, and then be that way in the moment when we're called on to show up wisely. And so what that being dimension really requires and demands of us is that we turn inward and engage in a lot of self-reflection. So you can know about business success, you can practice it when the stakes are low and see yourself do it and think, oh yeah, I got this. And then in order to be able to continue that practice wisely when the stakes are high, and also know when to not practice, know when to say no to life, or not no to life, but no to, some demand of life that's calling at you, right? Create boundaries, those kind of things. We need to develop the being, our being dimension of learning. And the being dimension is, it can be kind of accessed through mindfulness practice, journaling, self-reflection, the personal inquiry. I always recommend resources for further learning. So there's certain podcasts such as, is it okay if I
yeah, of course,
highlight a podcast on here? Okay.
Yeah.
On Being with Krista Tippett.
Okay.
Phenomenal. Yeah. I highly recommend it for gaining personal wisdom. What's really cool about human flourishing and wisdom as topical areas is that they can be applied to any context. So if you can know how to create flourishing and find wisdom when it comes to making hard decisions as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, as someone in real estate, as that in that industry and domain, you can also, those same insights, because they're not contextual, they're not industry specific, the same insights around flourishing wisdom can be used in healthcare, in law, in our personal lives, in any context. And so the being dimension isn't all that complicated. It's just difficult to access because our world doesn't give us a lot of opportunity and room and support professionally, usually, to spend time turning inward and focusing on ourselves.
Well, so it can feel wildly indulgent.
Yes.
At a time when the stakes are high, indulging is like the last thing that you want to think of, for me anyway. And it's so funny that we're having this conversation because this is a challenge that I'm like actively working through at this time. And if we look back at the last 2 years, it's been real. There's been a lot going on in real estate. In real estate specifically, we saw the entrance of more new agents than ever in the last 2 to 5 years. So there's lots of new agents entering in at a time where the market cycle is at unprecedented ranges. And so we are in a market cycle where home appreciation values have gone up almost 30% year over year in the last 2 years in areas. The competition is super fierce. There's very low inventory. And it's you go out there and you're in a fight for your life with every client. Yeah. And the rejection, the calculus that has to happen with every offer to see how can we stand out from 12 other bids. There's just so much. And I have found that me specifically, while our business is booming and doing really well, that is because we've been able to train our resilience to operate at this level over the last several years. We have the benefit of experience. Many new agents, for example, don't, or many agents who have operated at the same level for the last 10 to 20 years are suddenly feeling whiplash because they're where did this come from? They weren't paying attention to the signs. And then suddenly the market just came galloping ahead and whipped them across the face. And they're like, crap, I can't pivot as fast as I need to keep my business afloat. What do I do? In sets the fear. Right. And that in itself is a very traumatic experience, especially for veteran agents who have been in the business and had successful businesses for 10 to 20 years, but they did not evolve at the same rate as the industry has. And so where this is, I can't speak for the rest of the industry. It's 1.5 million individuals, but what I can do is speak for myself. And my experience is not necessarily wholly unique, but it is my experience. We have entered into this crazy market cycle. It's been super challenging. I've launched a second business in coaching and mentoring, which has been super fun, but also you're constantly flooded with the feelings that others and the struggles that others are experiencing. We've grown our family, so we became parents.
Yes, and congratulations.
Thank you. And we have reached a new level of success and with our business that we've never seen. So it's this weird paradox where we are experiencing the highs of success that we've experienced so far, which is super fun, and also feeling more friction and challenge than ever before.
Yeah.
And that oscillation where you're constantly trying to pivot throughout minutes, hours throughout the day to those different roles is so challenging. And so my question for you then, is that where self-care matters? Because is it the self-care that allows you to tap into that being in presence to find that peace? Because I'm working on that, and I realize like I literally have not listened to music in like 3 years just for fun.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
Sophia, I was beating myself up last week for reading fiction, like fictional romance, just as a moment to veg and chill and like deregulate a little bit. And I'm sitting there reading while I have like these shirts that I need to hang up next to me. And I'm like, man, I'm such a lazy piece. Like I can't, I'm sitting here reading when I should be cleaning my room. Whatever you have for the 5 minutes of time when you don't have a toddler screaming in your face.
Right. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you shared that, because that is such a common experience. And to feel that guilt for, you used the word indulgence. I'm really glad you used that word, because I'm going to use it in a minute, in a slightly different way. And I want us to think about it. But I completely resonate with this. I am a recovering perfectionist, hardcore. Okay. And I know a lot of people are, and especially entrepreneurs, right? Because it's all about you. Like you are the face, you are the, financial person, you are the marketing person, you are the sales person, you are your brand, you are everything. And so, gosh, the pressure to constantly be focused and on and get it right. And then if you're not working, the pressure then to, and oftentimes our perfectionism tendencies or ambitious tendencies transfer from our professional lives to our personal lives and back. Yep. And so it's like, when do we get a break? When do we get a break, right? And I have to tell you, I'm just a little bit of, vulnerable disclosure here. It is very hard to get over these tendencies. Like for me personally, I have been actively working against my perfectionism for a long time, And it's really challenging. And perfectionism is not a good thing. It's a limiting thing, because it holds us to these standards where we feel like we have to be perfect all the time, and we can't let our creative juices kind of do some of the work for us.
Yeah, there's no expansion there. There's no expansion when you have some semblance of like a limit of perfection.
Totally. You're going to do really, really well in your box here, right? And maybe incrementally you'll move a little bit further, your box will get a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. But when we can let that go, and I've had moments of this, it's not how I always live, but I'm trying more. I've had moments of this where when you let the kind of perfectionism or that need to be constantly producing or constantly doing something, when you let that go, then you can get into these more flow type states where you come up with your more interesting, profound, innovative insights. And a quote from my study is, one of my participants said, you need to leave space for innovation.
Yeah.
Innovation requires space, And so, and that's why we have our good ideas in the shower, when you're cooking or jogging or somewhere where, you're kind of in forced space, or reading a good book, right? So let's talk about self-care. So one of the huge differences between the two groups was that the mindfulness group was over twice as creative. Okay. And one of the huge differences was that they would constantly take time for self-care. And when I did this study with them, over the last couple of years, I took self-care, when they told me that they engaged in self-care, I took that at face value. I thought, oh, okay, I know what self-care is. It's, things make you feel good, or whatever things people do to, take a bubble bath or relax or whatever, right? Well, it wasn't till about a year went by, and then COVID hit, and I did this other study with my research team out of Arizona State on collective resilience in the face of collective trauma or collective coping. And what I found in that data was that people actually didn't know, more often than not, people don't know what self-care is. And this was really illuminating to me, because I thought, oh my gosh, I have this huge finding about self-care from my leadership study. And now I'm asking people who are in all sorts of positions, leaders, employees, unemployed, parents, stay-at-home parents. I'm asking them about their self-care practice. And through a little bit of digging, it's kind of come to the surface in this data that people don't actually know what self-care is. And that was a profound moment of realization for me as a scholar, as a researcher, but also just personally and practically. And so through that data, I put together a self-care framework. And if we have time, I'll walk you through it.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this, I'd love the people who are listening to this to kind of follow along, because I think you'll get something really practical out of it. Self-care, when we look up the dictionary definition of self-care, it's basically, activities that restore your well-being. Okay. So things people do to restore their well-being. What we find in leadership research is that when we restore our own well-being, we are much better able to restore other people's well-being. So it's kind of, we call this co-elevating leadership, where my flourishing helps other people flourish if I have a social intention or I'm focused on a social good.
Mm-hmm.
And so self-care can be really important as a leadership capacity. But because people don't know what it is, anyway, I'll get to this framework here. It's important to identify. So
yeah,
what I found was that people do four types of activities pretty regularly in their day-to-day lives. And regularly could be every day, every week, twice a week, etc., but frequently. The first is activities that feel bad now, but feel good later. Okay. And so if feel bad now, feel good later. So can you think of anything, Stefanie, that fits this category for you? Things you do that you're like, oh, I don't enjoy this, but when I'm done, I'm glad I did it.
I mean, I drug my butt unwillingly into the gym this morning, and I feel pretty good about that. I did not feel good about it at 6 a.m.
Okay, exactly. That's a perfect example. Mm-hmm. Perfect example. I don't like going to the gym either. Or like reading. Another one is I've been trying to read financial planning books, and I just find them so boring. And but then afterwards, I feel productive.
Yeah.
So that a lot of times people think that's self-care. They think the gym is self-care. They think that, reading a book on self-help is self-care. They think that, jogging is self-care. That category for most people is actually self-development. So it's something you're doing. No. Yeah. Self-development. It's good. It's a great category. It's so helpful. It makes us better. It helps us improve. But if you
I'm
think
not getting
self-care,
restorative from that. Like, that doesn't sound restorative to me.
No, it's not. You're not going to get the full benefits, restorative benefits that self-care can give us.
Right.
If all you're doing is self-development. And so this is like the biggest, aha, brain explosion moment for me too. Because I was like, oh my God, I'm constantly in a self-development mode, but I'm always feeling burnt out,
Shocking.
Shocking. Okay. So the second category that people engage in is activities that feel bad now and feel bad later.
Yeah.
And I don't want to put you on a spot, but if you can't, do you have any activities that you do that feel that fit in this category?
So one thing I'm working on is knowing when is when for just idle scrolling on social media. I'm researching TikTok strategies, for example, for real estate marketing. Sometimes that research gets into like an idle scroll that, exposes me to a lot of content that are not serving me. And then I get off the app just kind of like irritated. And then later on, I'm thinking about the time that I spent on the app and I think, gosh, I need to have some boundaries there.
That is a great example. If it's content that's not making you feel good while you're looking at it, right, and then you feel drained afterwards, and then beat yourself up afterwards for spending so much time trying to do this thing that was going to be maybe productive, but that's not what ended up, how it felt for you. Sure. Yeah, that definitely can be that category. I always say too, if you have like a family member, I'm not going to name anyone, but if you have a family member that likes to complain a lot on the phone, but you feel like I'm obligated to call them.
You see that caller ID come up and you're like,
yeah, I got to do this. I got to take this. Yeah. So that's like, okay. So this category, this quadrant is self-sacrifice.
Okay.
So you're sacrificing your well-being because you have an obligation, or you feel like you have an obligation to do something. So it's, this is adulting. This is doing your taxes when you're not going to get a refund. This is,
I was just thinking taxes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. That's coming up soon for us, right? Yeah. Scrolling TikTok because you have to learn TikTok. You feel like you have to learn TikTok, but it's not restorative in any way, right? So you're sacrificing something, right? Mm-hmm. This is self-sacrifice. No one thinks this category is self-care, but it's important to point it out because it's one of the types of things we spend our time doing, right? So it's good for self-awareness to know, okay, what do I spend my time doing?
Yeah.
The third category, and this one also gets misconstrued for self-care pretty often, similarly to the first. These are activities that feel really good now, but not so good later. So I live walking distance from Milk Bar here in New York, which is this delicious bakery.
Oh yes, I'm well acquainted.
Okay. They make the most Oh, the birthday cake, the truffles, the cookies. I mean,
Yeah.
so eating like 4 of the pieces of cake instead of just maybe half of one, you know, because they're big, like bricks.
God, but they're so good. And so I'm not even going to go into it. If you guys have seen the Netflix special, definitely check it out. So they have one in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Both are even too close for me being in Phoenix. But I hear you. But the same thing can be alcohol, right?
Yes,
Like
totally.
margarita night. Like for me, one big thing this year for me has been like calibrating my relationship with alcohol, because even that, like, yeah, oh my gosh, I need a drink, I need to like just de-stress from this crazy day, and then you wake up the next day with a headache.
Exactly. And then you're depleted and you're starting the day on a
Yeah.
less than spectacular note. Yeah, that's another one that came up a lot in the study I did with how people cope with COVID. So thinking that self-care was having, you know, wine at night, which it potentially can be, but overdoing it, right? Is where they talked about that a lot, especially during COVID. So this category is not self-care, it's self-indulgence. So feels good now, bad later.
Okay.
This could also be like gossiping with a friend, you know, so it feels good now, but afterwards you feel kind of guilty. It
Mm-hmm.
could be, you know, it could be social media. If you know, that could be self-sacrifice. That could also be self-indulgence, right? Scrolling, you know, spending too long and then feeling guilty. It's basically anytime you do something that feels good and then you feel guilty or depleted after the fact. So
Yep.
this isn't like an inherently wrong category. There's no moral imperative to this. I mean, I don't ever plan on not having a bunch of milk bar cake when I go there. Like I'm going to do it when I go there, but it's just about drawing awareness to, okay, that isn't necessarily self-care. And so what we're left with, people toggle. And this is the most profound part of this research finding, I think. People toggle between self-development and self-indulgence
Mm-hmm.
because they're burnt out on self-development. They're then self-indulging to respond to the burnout and the overwhelm.
Right.
And then it's just this constant cycle back and forth. And self-care is when you can kind of pull yourself out of that and find activities that feel good now and feel good later.
So
Do you have anything?
discipline is a factor here. And why does self-care require so much discipline? Because self-indulgence is no discipline, and it can be when it becomes a problem. That's when you like the wheels fall off. You're binging, you're drinking a bottle of wine at night. Not that I've ever done such a thing. Or you're like, you know, over snacking or whatever. Self-care, it takes discipline to be like, no, I'm not going to watch Netflix until 10 tonight. I'm going to instead take a bath, you know, read a book, have a little nighttime meditation or mindfulness.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Stefanie, I'm so glad you brought this up because I just had an insight here on this call. Like right as you were talking, right as you said that, you just gave me a kind of a research insight that just is blowing my mind right now. So thank you for this. It's
Yeah.
being recorded right here that this came from you. Um, self-indulgence. With self-indulgence, the guilt comes after. With self-care, the guilt comes first. So we don't
Mm-hmm.
engage in self-care, right? Because we feel guilty for stopping what we're doing and our obligations to our work or our families or our communities and going over in our little book corner and reading a fun fiction book on romance. We feel guilty for taking half a day off from work because we've been working 6-day weeks, 7-day weeks. We feel guilty for taking half a day off and just going to the park with our dog.
Yeah.
You know, we feel guilty for taking a bubble bath and staying in there for an hour, you know? And so with self-indulgence, the deed's already been done. And so it's like, okay, I feel guilty, but I'm gonna ignore it and just keep moving on with my headache or my
Yeah.
sugar stomach ache, you know? But with self-care, we have to be really intentional and say, you know what, I'm going to recognize that I'm gonna feel guilty for this. I'm going to choose to do it anyway, because I know that when we can stop and engage in self-care, we actually gain more clarity and wisdom. We downregulate our anxiety and we therefore come back to the problem, our lives, our situations with more clarity and wisdom is better for everyone. And to me, it takes guts, it takes courage, but what could be really powerful is when we develop these habits is we can craft our lives and our schedules in a way that is more workable for us and that does create more flourishing. So another thing I'll just touch on real quickly here is that I used to think that my success and achievement and the things that were going well in my life professionally had to do were a response to or an outcome of perfectionist tendencies. And what I am slowly but surely learning is that actually that's not the case at all. The success and the outcomes, the positive outcomes, are a manifestation, a blooming of my own inherent wisdom and creativity, and be able to see things in different ways and articulate things in unique ways. So it's actually it's me that's making these things happen in so many words. It's not my perfectionist demands. Yes, it's in you. And so if we can step back and engage in self-care, it actually can come out of us more in more flow, with more freedom and flexibility and joy and fun.
So you said earlier something about how this is very contrary to kind of like the status quo, and how that requires us to do a lot of pushback. Even
Yes.
you just sharing that idea feels so tempting to me, right? Like, yes, like I'm being drawn in. That makes so much sense. And I want that for my life. And then my egoic mind goes like, but what about all of the control? Where is because I am a white knuckler myself. And I just think that that's so interesting, because like it truly does, as you say, like it does all kind of come together right at the end. The more we're able to grow and tap into the things that allow us to grow, the better the results we're going to find. And like you truly can have, in our context anyway, that beautiful business that supports an incredible lifestyle and also serves the people who you're working with. That is so interesting. Sorry, I'm just processing. So what do you do? Do you just draw the bubble bath? like when you come to that acceptance, where do you go from there?
So one of my participants used this kind of metaphor that I think is just beautiful. And so I'd like to share it with you. It's basically a response to your question. So she said she's a super high performer, okay, out there in the world, and objectively incredibly successful, right? And she said that she sprinkles self-care, a little self-care, into her life every day. She sprinkles it into her life. It is not the main dish. It will never eclipse the main dish, because if it does, it would become self-indulgence. Your whole life would be too indulgent, right? But you sprinkle it in intentionally into your day. And that allows her to kind of step out of the tumult, step out of the white knuckling, step out of the hamster wheel, and find those little moments of personal quiet and self-grace so that she can come back better. To be frank with you, all of the people that I interviewed, I mean, I wouldn't say all, sorry, a majority of the people I interviewed, specifically from the mindfulness group, are self-proclaimed perfectionists or recovering perfectionists and highly ambitious type A people. They have found this other way of operating as a response to years and years of white knuckling. And they have been able to find more flourishing through it, because it's not like becoming lazy or doing shoddy work or becoming sloppy. That you're internally, you will actually find more, like, fewer mistakes when you're not as anxious, because you're not as myopic. You're able to see things from a broader perspective, right? And so you're actually able to see kind of more of what's going on. It's kind of like a little superpower. So you like make less mistakes. Your decisions tend to be more aligned with your values, so you don't have to go back as much and undo, decisions made. And then also, if there are problems that arise, when we can kind of give ourselves some of that self-grace and self-compassion, we're able to, which sometimes we need to pause and step away from the problem in order to do that, we're able to move through problems more swiftly, because we don't spend time and emotional energy or cognitive energy belaboring the problem by beating ourselves up or talking it out exhaustively with everybody. Instead, through kind of tapping into our own having our quiet time and letting ourselves be fully human and not just working machines, we can tune into our own wisdom more directly, give ourselves some compassion when we make mistakes, and just keep moving forward. And you see people out in the world who operate this way, and they just kind of have this sense of calmness to them.
Yeah.
But typically they're performing at a very high level, just doing it with their shoulders a little bit dropped and their hands a little bit more free and more smiles on their face.
Right. To me, that's a sense of flow, right? When I'm speaking to someone or seeing someone just kind of in their element, performing at a high level, and things just start getting done and execution feels easy and swift, that to me is a state of flow. So it sounds like we all need to get really curious about what those things are that allow us to feel restored, to come back to center, be able to tap into that presence. And I love the trigger of like, when do you feel guilt for carving out that time? Yeah. I think that is very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for kind of prompting that insight. I think that's important because, if we feel guilt after the fact, we've already done it, right? If we feel guilt beforehand, we can deal with that guilt and say, is this really skillful? Is having this guilt skillful? Is it necessary? It's really hard to untangle, our guilt. It's really hard to untangle our guilt. But even also, that another thing too is you can set aside just 5 minutes a day to do something that feels good now and feels good later. You might not be able to go to the park, but you could definitely go sit on your couch and breathe, or go listen to your favorite song and, with your eyes closed and no kids in the room, just listen to your favorite song for 3.5 minutes, do some stretching or something, whatever. It could be so small and minor, but you do it regularly. And then you're basically teaching yourself that you're giving yourself permission to slow down and take that time.
Yeah, I love it. You said that beautifully, giving yourself permission to invest that time and energy into something that's going to really, truly give you a return. So where is your research leading you next?
Well, I'll be studying love in the organization, love and organizing. Yes. And I'm so excited. So I just got invited on to, this just happened a couple of weeks ago. I got invited on to be an advisory board member for Harvard's Human Flourishing project.
Wow.
And her Human Flourishing program and this love project. And so I'll be doing some research partnering with them and my team at Fordham. And I love it because only Harvard could get away with saying, we're going to study love in the organization. It's like so bold, but I think it's beautiful because, and what we mean by love is not romantic love per se, or even necessarily paternal love, like parent, child, but we're talking about human love. And what that looks like is, I'll say it in the form of a question. How can we create workplaces or organizations where people show up and they feel like their inherent dignity as a human being is being honored?
Yep.
That's love. That's big love.
Yeah. I would also say, from my perspective, that has to be true on the service side as well.
What do you mean with your clients?
Right. So whoever the organization is benefiting, it's not only internal, it has to be part of that product. Oh man, that is so interesting. I want to hear more about it. So maybe we'll have to do a round 2 when you've got some teeth in there to come and share. I would love to hear more about that. That is so fascinating.
Absolutely. I can leave your listeners with one little tidbit that they can do. They can practice with their clients, actually.
Yeah.
That is a form of this kind of human love. It's silent. No one will know they're doing it. And it actually can increase their perceived charisma. So how charismatic you show up in the world with other people by doing this simple little thing.
Yeah.
Would you like an activity, some homework? Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
Homework from the professor. Okay. So typically when we kind of interact with people in our lives, be it coworkers, colleagues, people, our clients, customers, even our bosses, people out there in the world, whoever, we tend to engage with these people in this from what's called an I-it perspective, I-it. And Martin Buber, a philosopher, wrote about this if anyone's interested to do some more reading, but I'll summarize it briefly here. So the I-it perspective is basically where I treat people kind of like they are a function to me. So a customer is a customer. This is someone who buys things from me. Mm-hmm. A customer service person on the phone serves a function. They're meant to serve me or fix a problem I have, right? The person on the train is a function. They're just another warm body on the subway, or they're the person that is driving the train or whatever, right? So everyone we meet, we kind of tend to see them as their function, their role, and who they are to us, right? In that way. And so that's I-it. And it's not, if you operate this way, this does not make you a bad person. We all do. It's just how we kind of move through the world efficiently, basically. But if we can pivot from this I-it perspective to what Martin Buber calls the I-thou perspective, then we actually engage with people in much more meaningful, robust ways that make them feel like we actually see them, we get them, we acknowledge their humanness, we acknowledge their dignity. And the I-thou relationship is basically just looking at the person, and it's so simple, it's so silent, and it's private. It's looking at the person you're interacting with and thinking to yourself, I acknowledge you are a full and complete human being. You just say that internally, silently to yourself. And I have found personally, just anecdotally, when I do this, even if I'm just like at Starbucks ordering a coffee, and I think to myself, when I'm talking to the person, ringing me up by order, I acknowledge you're a full and complete human being. Or now I just use the term in my head. I just think I thou, because I've used that little mantra.
Yeah.
Well, I will engage with them differently. I will maybe I'll make more eye contact. I'll smile more. It comes naturally. When you interact with people that way, it comes naturally. And they respond back to me differently. Mm-hmm. And so it's wonderful in sales, right? Because customers oftentimes feel like a function, or like, oh, what do you want from me? Or there's not as much trust there. Probably not in everyone's situation, but that can be, pretty prevalent. And so responding to people from this I thou perspective kind of can break down some barriers of who we are, and make people feel very seen. And so I would encourage people to do that throughout their day. Just practice and see what happens.
Thank you for that. I am going to read further on that. That's actually a big part of what we do with my mentoring is I truly believe one of our values is practicing extreme empathy. And what that means is caring enough about the individuals that we are hoping to serve, the members of the public, caring enough about their problems, their needs, their desires, their hopes, their fears, to understand how we can serve that, not necessarily open a door or put a sign in the yard.
Yes.
Love that.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, I love that.
Oh my gosh, awesome. Sophia, this was so fun. I could take over your entire afternoon and talk to you for hours, but I've taken too much of your time already. I want to be a good steward of that. Where can those find you if they want to learn more about what it is you're doing?
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, I had a blast too. This is so much fun. I had a blast talking to you. I love chatting about these things and hearing your insight too. Offline, I'll have to tell you. We'll have to connect more.
Yeah.
So they can find me I'm on Instagram, sophia.town. And I'm also on LinkedIn, Sophia Town. And I also have my website is currently drsophiatown.com.
Beautiful.
You can find me there as well.
Okay. I'll be sure to have those linked in the show notes. Sophia, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and your findings with us here on the show. I really appreciate it. It was a blast. You'll have to come back for another time.
Would love to. See you later.